So now it's really my job to introduce the person who will be introducing our honored speaker tonight, and that is our very own Philip K. Smith III, who we will be showcasing at the museum with a major survey exhibition this winter. We are very excited to present, yes, exactly, those Philip K. Smith fans, let's show some love. This exhibition is a major survey of his work for 2 decades, with artworks that you probably unlikely to have seen before, partly because no one's seen them before. Is that right? Yeah. And it will be our headline act for our exhibitions this year. So we're very, very excited to be able to have that exhibition, and I hope you'll join us for the opening party on November 30th for that. And he's also the honored guest at our gala this year on January 28th. So this is a great time to have Philip K. Smith come up on stage and introduce our honored speaker, Leo Marmol. So thank you, Philip.
Just proof that if you hang out at the same museum since first grade, they'll finally buckle and give you a show and honor you at the gala. But honestly, it's a real honor to be continually involved with this great institution that I've known for a very long time, and an honor to be able to introduce Leo Marmol today. So thank you for being here. Starting back in 1991, I was trained as an architect within the confines of an art school. For many years, I worked and struggled between the worlds of art and architecture. It took the recession and its overnight cancellation of most of my architecture projects to push me happily into my dream of being a full-time artist. It was a dicey, difficult, and highly stressful time. I had an identity crisis displayed publicly across 2 websites, one for art and one for architecture. And one day, I put in a call to pull the plug on my architecture site. And just like that, the blood, sweat, tears, and hundreds of all-nighters of my 20s and early 30s instantaneously, poof, disappeared. Yet still today, I say that I couldn't be doing what I'm doing if it weren't for architecture. And it's in this fact that I relate distinctly to Leo Marmol's artistic practice. Architecture is at our roots, but art is the muse that guides us at our core. Certainly, we all know the Leo Marmol of Marmol Radziner architecture. We know about the seemingly effortless, precisely perfect preservation of important Palm Springs and Los Angeles historic structures. We know about the prefab leadership of Marmol Radziner that first started here in the desert in Desert Hot Springs. We know about the elegantly modern, spatially flowing modern residences that his office deftly creates, involved in all areas of detail and design. His firm's About page states that they are, quote, a team of architects, interior designers, landscape designers, metal fabricators, carpenters, furniture makers, and construction crew possessing a depth of knowledge and breadth of experience that cannot be found at a single disciplined firm. That is his architecture practice. Today, we will learn more about his art practice. And that, by definition, is not a team of people, but rather a single individual. And that is entirely the point. Free from the typical constraints of architecture, read client, contractor, city official, client, plumber, and client. Did I mention client? Marmol can enter his studio solo, assemble his creative surfaces, gather his tools, ranging from spray paint to palette knives to brushes to trowels, and make singular decisions based solely on his intent that day, that time, for reasons known only to him. You may not know this, but he's been painting since the 80s. His architecture firm, by the way, was established in 1989. So in a way, his desire to paint perhaps predates or runs parallel with his passion for architecture. This balance between 2 distinct worlds has been part of Leo's life for some time. Identifying as both Cuban and American, he said that his family is still divided between a loathing for all things created and destroyed by Castro and a belief that the original Cuban revolution was an honorable and necessary fight for justice and equality. Here in California, I feel that he is happily caught between the cool, foggy SoCal urban landscape of Venice Beach and the warm, dry expanse of our Coachella Valley desert. Looking at the portfolio of Leo's work, I'd say that he balances logics of revealing and covering, of scraping away and building up, of transparency versus opacity, of absolute structure versus organic, hand-driven freedom, of balancing 2 dimensions with 3 dimensions, of reds versus blues, of architecture versus art. But really, if you've ever heard Leo speak in a difficult room with a difficult subject matter, you'll know that it's not about this versus that. Leo has an incredible way of weaving a room of disparate thoughts together into a united front. It is a sight to behold. His canvases seem to quietly and meditatively perform that same task, effortlessly weaving together the richness of his own varied thoughts and experiences. And while you may just recently be hearing about Leo's personal artistic pursuits made more public over the last 3 years or so, we find an artist that sees clearly his vision through his various pasts, skill sets, disciplines, challenges, and opportunities that he's faced, overcome, and invited in. His is a vision that inspires and allows us to see him individually, Leo Marmol, on his own. We see what is happening in his mind and in his soul, and that is the true joy of art, to see things that are typically unseen and to talk about things for which there are no words, only scrapes of a trowel, the application and removal of pigment, and the bold choice to show up in the studio every day to make work no matter what. Ladies and gentlemen, Leo Marmol.
Wow, I feel like I should quit while I'm ahead. Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Adam. Thanks to Modernism Week, especially Mark Davis, who made this possible. Thanks to Melissa Morgan and her incredible team at the gallery. Thanks to the Palm Springs Art Museum. I'm honored to be a trustee here. And most of all, thank you all for coming today. I'm really excited. I will tell you, my kids are here, Emmy and Leo. So thank them for, although they had no choice to be here. This presentation is in association with Melissa Morgan Fine Art, a show entitled First Light, Then Shadow, and that opens tonight at 5:30. Now around 6:30 this evening, Steve Nash, the former director of this fine institution, will deliver some opening remarks for the exhibition. I hope to see you all there, and we'll have to get some more wine. If I play this right this morning, there should be some time for questions and answers following this conversation. So my work at the show at Melissa Morgan is a personal meditation on my ongoing love affair with the desert. When Melissa invited me to join this group, my response in the studio began with a playful exploration of color and wildflower blooms in Borrego Springs. And that initial exploration kind of grew into a much more subdued examination of the relationship between light and the more intangible or spiritual aspects of this amazing landscape. The paintings in the show exist somewhere between the abstract and the literal, and they draw heavily on the color, texture, and forms of the Coachella Valley. I initially came to Palm Springs in 1992 with my business partner, Ron Radziner, at the invitation of Brent and Beth Harris to visit Richard Neutra's design for the Kaufman House. We came in August, and it was well over 120 degrees. And so that initial introduction introduced me both to the intense climate of Palm Springs, as well as the astounding influence that modern architecture has within this valley. I was familiar with the Kaufman House through the incredible photography of Julius Shulman. And following that initial introduction to the home, we began a 5-year restoration process using Julius Shulman's photographs as the most significant and comprehensive roadmap for the restoration work. Julius Shulman's most famous photograph of the home is this black and white photo, referred to as the Twilight Shot. Now, this image depicts California modernism as a romantic, soothing oasis of beauty and sensuality. But it's actually a time-lapse photograph. This photograph initially was created by Julius Shulman opening the lens to expose the setting sunlight over the mountaintop. He then closed the shutter, reset the lights within the house, and opened the shutter again. He asked Mrs. Kaufman to lay in front of the pool light to block the glare, opened the shutter again, exposed the film. During that time, Julius Shulman told me this great story that while she was laying there, their little dog wandered into the frame and was immortalized by Julius's momentary opening of the aperture and exposing the film. So this touchstone of modernism does not actually exist in the physical reality of the Kaufman House. You will never experience this view if you visit the site. What's important about this image is that it created a mythology of modern lifestyle in a way that could never truly exist in the mere physical reality of the building. This current celebration of Palm Springs modernism that brought so many of you here didn't exist 30 years ago. It wasn't until the completion of the Kaufman House restoration and a number of other restoration projects in the mid-1990s that the local community and the world awoke to the significance of the reservoir of modern buildings that are here in the valley. Modernism Week was born in 2006 and initially attracted a few thousand people. By 2012, Modernism Week grew to over 12,000 visitors. In 2020, an estimated 162,000 people attended the event, all coming to bask in this desert mirage of modern comfort and sensuality. One aspect of the desert that I particularly love is the tension between the reality of this harsh desert and the mythology of modern luxury. That tension has attracted a wide spectrum of artists and architects, and I very much enjoy the conversation between the high art of modernism and Desert X with the outsider culture of the deep desert. So let's quickly look at a couple of important high art examples that exist in the margins between architecture and art. Philip K. Smith's Lucid Stead and Doug Aiken's Mirage. Philip Smith's Lucid Stead is a celebration of the simple desert homestead. What became known as the Jack Rabbit homesteads populated the desert from the late 1930s to the 1950s. These haphazard structures were a product of a government subsidy program that leased unusable federal land to applicants willing to build a home on the property within 3 years. So while Palm Springs was becoming this resort destination for the rich and famous, these modest little homesteads became a parallel economic reality, a parallel economic universe for the non-elite working class here in the valley. Philip's piece was created in Joshua Tree in 2013 and was described by Philip as tapping into the quiet pace of change here in the desert. Animating the shack with strips of mirror, Philip sought to redirect our perception of light and shadow back into the landscape. By day, the sun itself reveals branded reflections of the landscape against the parched wood. By night, an eerie inner light emerges from the cracks, highlighting the dry, gradual withering while painting the windows and doors in this perfect museum-like color. The work confronts the beauty of decay and elevates this found object to high art, or by challenging us with reflection and color. Lucid Stead will forever haunt me by reminding me of this in-between space of high and outsider art within the desert. Another high art piece that I will eternally carry with me is Mirage by Doug Aiken. Doug is a true master at creating mythology and visual stories that create traditions and beliefs. While Lucid Stead began as a found object, Mirage was constructed as an archetypal California ranch house. Doug then covered every square inch of the nondescript ranch house with mirrors, transforming a suburban home into this kind of magical reflection of nature and our desire to inhabit that landscape. Mirage is constantly in flux. The house reacts to the ever-evolving motion of the sun and the moon, never appearing exactly as it was a moment ago. Both Lucid Stead and Mirage, like the Schulman Twilight photograph, entice us to believe in this vision of the desert as filled with color and movement, texture and beauty, comfort and sensuality, devoid of danger and discomfort. Simultaneously, in the desert, there exists a formidable outsider art culture. The essence of outsider culture is exemplified in the work of Noah Purifoy. Now, Noah doesn't exactly fit the traditional definition of outsider art since he has a formal art training and background. However, Noah collected found objects and reassembled them in refreshing ways to transform their purpose and meaning. Now, Noah began this process with charred debris from the Watts Rebellion in 1965. Similar to Lucid Stead, the core of Purifoy's work in the desert embraces desert decay. Purifoy was interested in the impact the desert environment played on his curious little collections. Noah stated, quote, "I do assemblage, I don't do maintenance," unquote. Remains of his work is a tapestry of material erosion where change is accepted as necessary and accelerated by the harshness of the desert climate. Purifoy, like so many artists and architects, made the desert his home and spent the last 15 years of his life creating an extensive collection in what is now an outdoor museum dedicated to his life and his work. His 10-acre outdoor museum in Joshua Tree continues to erode, allowing the work to eventually be fully reclaimed by the desert. Purifoy, like Lucid Stead and Mirage, exposes and makes legible geologic time as well as the extreme, destructive, powerful forces of nature. So let's talk a little bit about my painting. And I will tell you, this is incredibly uncomfortable for me, being that this is the first time I've done this. I've gotten so used to talking about architecture. This is a new world for me to talk about. So my personal journey with painting began, as Philip mentioned, while I was at Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo in the 1980s. And here's photographic proof, because only in the 80s was it cool to have a mullet. Now, some of you should talk to my kids about that because they don't believe me. I'm not a formally trained painter. I studied architecture and philosophy. So when art critic Roger Cardinal coined the phrase outsider art in 1972, Cardinal was referencing certain self-taught or naive art makers who were not formally trained. So this puts me squarely in the camp of an outsider artist. Now, outsider art can also be seen as a rejection of established values within a dominant art culture. Modernism itself, as a historic movement, was outside, since it rejected the images and cultures of the past architectural movements. For me, painting was always a personal escape from the challenge and insecurity of being an architecture student. I painted in my free time, often with friends who taught me their process and opportunities that they found during painting. And because of that, my experience as a painter has always been idiosyncratic and spontaneous. One of the things I love about painting is the innate solitude and independence, as Philip was talking about. The power of the architectural process is that it's truly a team sport. While for me, painting is done by myself, bringing with it all the freedom and fear, having nobody else to depend on. And the practice of architecture demands the satisfaction of others. The list that Philip started, your client, the city, the design review board, the Historic Site Preservation Foundation, the Historic Site Preservation Board, the neighbors, the inspectors, the mother-in-law, the staff, it goes on and on. And so when you paint in secret, you don't have to make anybody happy. And because of that, I painted in the shadows and I hesitated to make my work more public. So that silence ended in 2019 when I was invited to have my first formal art show. So I was, of course, excited and horrified. Los Colores de Assimilation was curated by Gerard O'Brien at the Landing Gallery in Los Angeles and consisted of an assemblage of existing works. The Spanglish title of the show hinted at my background. I am a first-generation American-born Cuban. We often refer to ourselves as ABCs. My mother and father, who are up there in the upper left corner of the photograph, came to the U.S. prior to the Castro Revolution in Cuba for my father to study psychology at Pepperdine University. My parents had no intention of staying in the U.S. after my father finished school. My mom didn't speak English and very much wanted to return to her wealthy family in Cuba. But when Fidel Castro took control of Cuba in 1959, my parents elected not to return. In response, they adopted the prevailing objective at the time of assimilating into the American culture by abandoning their own culture of birth. We stopped speaking Spanish so we could blend in. My family was deeply divided after the Cuban Revolution between those who supported the Castro regime and those who mourned what was lost. My mother's family had their entire wealth nationalized, and the family disintegrated. There were those in our family who vilified Castro, and others who blamed the U.S. sanctions, military attacks, and assassination attempts for destroying the dream of liberation at the heart of the Cuban Revolution. This family tension inspired my second show, Flags de mis Padres. This was a pop-up show, again, by Gerard O'Brien at the Landing for NADA Miami, which was virtual in 2020 due to COVID. I had the privilege of doing the show with Chuck Arnoldi in a Frank Gehry designed loft in Venice. While Chuck displayed sculpture, my contribution focused on paintings of American and Cuban flags. The flag is a powerful cultural symbol. The flag paintings were a study on my relationship between my country of birth, the U.S., and my family's country of origin, Cuba. The American flag paintings became dark and brooding expressions of the Trump times we were living in, while the Cuban flag paintings were filled with an exuberance of color and movement. This expression of tropical joy was in complete contradiction to the actual circumstances of Cuban artists at the time. At that time, they were literally marching in protest over the censorship and political reprisal they often faced for their work. I naively painted American flags without thought or concern of any reaction by the US government, even while our political climate at that time was fraught with political division and racial violence. The poetry of my cousin Astley Marmol served as broad inspiration for the work. Astley grew up in Cuba and faced repression for his writing. It took Astley decades to orchestrate his escape from the island. The show celebrated my cousin's commitment to creative freedom. Title was a solo exhibition with the Patrick Gallery in Cambria, California in 2021. Title really drew heavily on my love for the ocean and included works that reflected the tenacity and excitement of ocean waves. Having grown up in California, I feel deeply connected to the ocean. The invitation to show work in Cambria kind of allowed me to return to the Central Coast, having studied in San Luis Obispo. So this brings me to the current show, First Light, Then Shadow. Helen Frankenthaler, one of my favorite paintings, looked to nature as a long-standing source of inspiration for her work. Frankenthaler relentlessly experimented with abstraction, drawing concrete allusions to nature through explicit titles of works that gracefully teetered on the edge of the real and the imagined. The abstract expressionist movement was entirely concerned with exploring profound emotional experiences, unearthing deep-rooted universal truths about who we are and where we come from. Frankenthaler said, "I had the landscape in my arms as I painted it. I had the landscape in my mind and shoulder and wrists," unquote. Much like the experience of being in nature, the act of painting provides me with the opportunity to reflect and meditate on my own feelings through movement. In November of 2021, I had the opportunity to work with Jerry McLaughlin, a painter I greatly admire. And in that lesson, it was to integrate cold wax into my work. Cold wax is, for me, the most natural and appropriate choice for the kind of thickly textured, built-up imagery that I've experienced with oil. All the works on exhibit at Melissa's gallery use the combination of oil and cold wax. I use painting as a coping mechanism, trying to make sense of my experience and emotions. Georgia O'Keeffe said, quote, "I found I could say things with color and shapes that I couldn't say another way, things I had no words for," unquote. Like nature's ability to unearth suppressed artifacts of the human condition, there's always a secret lurking within abstraction. Throughout my time in Palm Springs, the unusual interplay of light and color, coupled with the extremes of the environment, have profoundly affected the way I see and understand the desert landscape. The desert is beautiful and strange, deadly, yet teeming with life. It fascinates me how such intense vitality can present as serene one moment and chaotic the next. Every moment in the desert landscape feels more purposeful and intense. The days are thick as the heat beats down incessantly, and their nights are fraught with clarity at the absence of that abundant sunshine. The choreography between light and color in the desert is beautifully captured in the photography of Stephen Moore. Like the poetry of my cousin in the earlier show, Stephen's photographs served as a broad inspiration for my paintings in the current show. Stephen expresses wonderful reflections of the desert in all its vast texture, color, and form. The range of topography Stephen is able to document embodies what I consider to be one of the most enchanting aspects of this land, its huge variation, both geologically and human-made. The works for First Light Then Shadow are abstract, but the desert serves as an important departure in a way of organizing the compositions. Some works are literal landscape paintings. The origin of their inspiration is completely visible. I love coming to Palm Springs when it's 120 degrees because I have no choice but to slow down. Here, I can experience slowness without shame or anxiety. I don't feel compelled to go hiking or touring when it's 122 degrees. I can instead feel completely satisfied doing absolutely nothing by the pool. Through such extremes of temperature, we become more aware of our bodies and their vulnerabilities. The heat and discomfort are unifying because there's an innate understanding that everyone around us is experiencing the same thing. We all sweat equally in the desert. And this is why we come. The prolific range of modern architecture and art within this city offers, with what this city offers, is simply the excuse to attract a widely eclectic band of renegades like yourselves. Here we can hold each other without pretense and experience the surprise, joy, disappointment, and excitement I felt the first time I visited the Kaufman House in 1992. That feeling of inspiration and inadequacy that attracts so many to this inhospitable landscape. I am very grateful for this attraction that brought so many brilliant people to deposit their architectural artifacts that continue to haunt us and teach us, and ultimately collect us so we can feel vulnerable and supported while we're together. Thank you. So with that, we can actually bring the house lights up as well. I thought we have some time. I'd be happy to entertain some questions. If there's something you'd all like to talk about that we haven't talked about, I'm happy to talk about. And if no one raises their hands, I'm just going to call on my poor friends to ask questions. Okay, it's your conversation. Where would you like to go? Yes. So the question is, obviously it's too hot to actually paint outside, so did I photograph them first? I painted all the images for this show in Los Angeles, in Venice, where I live, in my studio. And so, yes, I was working from photographs, often the Stephen Moore photographs. They're all up in my studio right now. And so I painted from photographs or memory. They're not literal. There was an image of me painting in the garden. That was a totally staged photograph. I paint in my studio. Sorry about that. Other questions?
I have a microphone over here.
So we can actually use a mic if anyone wants to ask a question.
Thanks, Hillary. You didn't have to do that just because I'm your boss. So my question is, it seems like there's some real aesthetic similarities between your architectural interest and your painting. It seems like on one level, I mean, of course, obviously this aspect of light and how the light works in architecture, but in painting, but also it seems like your paintings have a real interest in structure. But all of the chaos, even in a painting like the one behind you, is contained within this very, strong, rectangular, even monumental kind of structure. Do you see that similarity?
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because, of course, thank you, Adam. Everyone always asks about this relationship, right? I work really hard to not talk about the relationship and try not to think about the relationship. I've always used painting as a way to kind of leave that aside. But, we are who we are. So it's impossible to kind of leave that behind. Sure, I'm an architect by training. I will also say the canvas or the field you're working in, it's inherently an architectural kind of contained space that you have to organize and make sense of. So I think there is a strong relationship, and it's all about light. Architecture is about light and movement. Painting at its best is about light and movement. And so sure, there's a relationship. I just try not to think about it. It's funny. And I absolutely never talk about it. So yeah, I think it exists, but I try not to. I don't paint architectural scenes. I don't paint to create architecture. And so I see them as distinct, but they mesh together. They blend together. I can't help it. Yes, in the very back. Go ahead and ask it and I'll repeat it. Interesting. Talk a bit about the transition between the mid-century period of architecture and what we're seeing today. Has there been a transition? I don't know. I'm not sure. I think personally, and I will say in our work architecturally, we are still very much working with the basic concepts of modernism and translating them, transitioning them into new technologies and new needs and desires and expectations that we all carry today for our architecture. But we believe that the issues of modernism are still relevant. In fact, you could argue they're more relevant today than they were back then because it's an issue of relationship, a relationship between the inside of the space and the outside of the space, a relationship within the building, within the home, a relationship between the rooms. In other words, it's a relationship of ourselves to nature and the exterior. And that relationship is becoming more and more relevant, more important, we're all more desperate to feel it. And so I think those ideals of modernism about that relationship don't need to transition. They're still vital and necessary today. And what's great about contemporary architecture, and I'm such a fan of architects because look, what we do is hard. Doing mediocre or bad buildings is hard. Right? Doing buildings that rise above that is Herculean. And then every now and then something magical in the landscape happens where a building sets itself apart and becomes culturally significant and important for all of us. That's mind-boggling to me because so many things have to come together to make those buildings happen. It doesn't happen very often, but every now and then it does. And those architects, those teams, those buildings, that neighborhood, all the things that made that possible need to be celebrated because it truly is. That means everybody is working way beyond the norm to make these kinds of magical things happen. We're still very much indebted to the ideals of modernism. We're still very curious about the issues. And sorry for this long answer. This is the problem with a really good question. We feel very fortunate to be able to learn from historic buildings. We do preservation work, restoration work, because we want to learn very directly from those buildings. Those lessons, like when you look at an Albert Frey building, those lessons are so relevant for contemporary architects today. Okay, another question. Yes. I'm not going to repeat the question. Did you all hear it? First of all, I'll say it's very funny. The first time I spoke in this lecture hall, it was during the restoration of the Kaufman House. So it was in the 90s. And Sidney Williams invited Ron Radziner and I to come and speak. And there were maybe, 15 people in the audience. And half of those were our own staff. And so, things have changed. Things have changed. There's a kind of exuberance, excitement about architecture and modernism, not only in this community, but in the much broader community. I think, in terms of my own, probably some of those at the early lectures were just our own insecurity and discomfort in speaking in front of people. It's weird. It's hard to do that. It feels very vulnerable. And I think talking about art for the first time, really in front of all of you, is exciting because it's the first time. And I'm trying my best to not necessarily show how uncomfortable this really does feel, but I appreciate it. My hair's different than it was in the 1990s. Yeah, Ron still wears black and his hair is still long, but his is starting to turn gray. I can't explain that either, yes. Yeah, canvas versus other things to paint on. The works in the Melissa Morgan Fine Art Gallery today are all on board. The thing about cold wax, when you mix cold wax with paint, it changes the consistency of the paint from more of a liquid to more of a solid. So you work differently. You rarely use a brush. In fact, there were a few photos where you saw me using a squeegee. That's the primary way you're applying the paint to the surface. And so canvas, when I used a squeegee, there's a give to canvas. Very different response to the tool. And so I have switched to board. I'm only painting on board now. And like I said, all the paintings you'll see in the gallery tonight are on board. And so there's no give to that. It's a solid surface. So when you push, all that's happening is, the paint is directly kind of responding to the tool, the squeegee. And so depending on how hard you're pushing the squeegee, depending how much paint you put onto the squeegee, I feel like I have more control over what's happening than I did with canvas. Canvas is amazing. It's wonderful. And in school, when I started painting, we painted on anything. We were all broke, right? So we painted on cardboard. We painted on, branches. We painted on wood we found. We painted on anything we could find. But today, I've moved away from canvas completely now to painting on board. Yes. Did everyone hear the question? Great. No? No. Okay. Well, just the conversation between architecture and philosophy, and I studied philosophy. It's true. I have a minor in philosophy, which I will tell you, when you're going to Cal Poly, which is a very, engineering rigid, some of you have been there and gone to school there, right? You have your first elective in your third year, and elective means you can choose from these 3 classes. I got off my program within my first year. I was not a star at Cal Poly. It's very funny. I was a problem child at Cal Poly because I got off track immediately. I studied philosophy. I got into the art program. I was in the theater program. And I would get hauled in regularly, no kidding, to the assistant dean's office. And they would say, you're taking the place of someone who's serious about architecture. And I'd say, no, it is because I'm serious about architecture that I'm doing all these other things. So it took me a long time to graduate. But yes, I studied philosophy because what excited me about, and what still excites me about philosophy, it's a conversation about how we think and what's important to us and values and learning. And it's these fantastic conversations that I wish our general conversation about politics and everything else was more informed by. Because you'd have to take a class on, reason or critical thinking. And so philosophy, do I study it today? No, of course not. I want to believe we're all practicing it. But certainly, if anything, philosophy creates a curiosity about the world, about how we think about the world, how we look at the world, how we talk about the world, and how we understand it. So to me, philosophy it's not a subject. It's a way of living that's self-critical and looks at the world critically. So I want to believe we're all trying to do that as best we can. Yes. Flag paintings, critical thinking, American political turbulence, this fantasy of tropical paradise, how that kind of blended into yes, I was thinking about all those things. I will say the Trump era for me was a very difficult time. It remains a difficult time, right? And so for me to start painting American flags at that time was a very emotional kind of thing for me. But I had to paint it because it was the only way I could start to deal with it a little bit. So yeah, the flags became these kind of, for me, these painful expressions. While my Cuban flags, it's an ideal of tropical paradise that doesn't really exist in Cuba today. I've only been there twice to visit family. And we took our kids once so they could meet our family. And so my fantasy of Cuba is very different than the reality of those that have ration cards and are watched and have to watch what they say in a restaurant. When we were there, we couldn't talk openly about politics. You don't talk about those things because people are listening and you don't know who's listening. And this kind of repression that exists in these kinds of cultures is so different than what we live with, right? None of us think about what we talk about at a restaurant, right? You can talk about Trump all day long. You can talk about whoever you want to talk about. You don't worry. I mean, you might worry a little bit, depending on how far you're going with your conversation, but you don't worry about being arrested because you feel one way or another about our government. That's an incredible opportunity. That is a freedom that we take for granted that, believe me, as a Cuban, when you visit, you are stunned as to how little opportunity you have to talk about all the things we take for granted. Fortunately, we want to believe there aren't that many countries left, like Cuba, where that exists, but it's there, and it's there in many other countries besides Cuba. But for me, that gives us a freedom and an opportunity that I hope we just appreciate. That's all. Yes, there was a question. Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever thought about it. Did everyone kind of hear the comparison to Helen Frankenthaler's work that has an opacity and a gentleness and a softness to it, and then my work that has an aggressive kind of frontal character. You didn't use that word. I used that word. He used very florid, wonderful words to describe the work. But I think, yeah, they are very different. I can't paint like Frankenthaler. Her work, that's why I love her work so much. It's so ethereal. It's so soft. It's so gentle in its power. I mean, for me, I find it incredibly powerful, but there's a subtlety to it that, man, I'm just not capable of. She has a kind of gentleness that I wish I had. My paintings are much more confrontational. They're just kind of in your face. They're very direct. And I think that's what makes her paintings better. Many, you might say maybe they just make them different. But that's why I love her work. And someday I hope to develop that kind of subtlety in the work. Oh, I do. For me, painting is physical. It's not philosophical. It's not psychological. It's physical. I see it as dance or movement. I love the smell of the paint, the texture of the paint. I love the physical act of painting. Similar to going on a hike. What do you love about going on a hike? You're seeing things, but it's your body in movement in nature. That's, to me, the same thing as painting. It's the physical act of painting. And so, yes, and that's why in many ways, so many of the paintings, I mean, that physicality is expressed. It's visible. The movement is visible. So cold wax, the question is, even the percentages of how much cold wax, you're a painter, how much percentage of cold wax versus paint, and how do you do that? It's part of the subtlety and joy of working in cold wax. You can, adjust the amount of cold wax that you're mixing in, and even that has impact on the response of the paint. The more cold wax you have, the thinner the paint gets visually, the less it's more like paint, and the thicker it becomes. And even the responsiveness to the surface of the board, in my case, changes depending on the percentage. The typical percentage of cold wax to paint is 50-50. Like when I studied with Jerry, that's what you start with. That's the lesson in learning with cold wax. I tend to use much more wax. I'm more like 75-50. And that lets it be a little less solid. The responsiveness is even a little more solid. So I tend to be heavy on cold wax. And so, other questions? We can take a few more. Yes. Question is inspiration of contemporary artists. In so many ways, it's similar. You get that question a lot with architecture. Who are your inspirations in architecture? It's funny. The answer is, I don't know. I try not to pay too much attention to what's happening in the architectural world or the art world. I love it when I see contemporary artists, and I love going to exhibits. I just, was at the Hammer the other day. I love going to see the work there. But I try not to pay too much attention, especially in architecture. Because for one thing, there's so many architects doing incredible work out there. And it's really intimidating to see it. So you try not to pay attention because you think, oh my God. But there's a lot to learn from all of that. And so, but you try to just do the best work you can today, make your own world. And I try not to pay attention. So in other words, I'm not answering your question. Yes. I'll take two more. Yes. What's in my future? I don't know. I don't know. Work continue. I have a job. I have a real job. That continues. I will say, my real job, we have some people here from our office. The greatest thing about my job is, number one, I get to work with clients that are really inspired and wanting to do great things, and that really encourage us to do our best work. But more than that, our staff is fantastic. We have a lot of people that work with us now. We have a staff of about 250 people. That's in architecture, landscape, interior design, construction, cabinet shop, metal shop. So it's this incredibly diverse group of people that we get to work with, all of them with amazing backgrounds and incredible talent, and this real discipline and strength in how they work and wanting to learn. So my greatest joy is that we get to work with really inspirational people, many of whom are way younger than I am. And they give me so much energy, and they bring new ideas and new lessons into the studio. So my future is to keep working with them. There's no plan to stop doing that. Ron and I will probably, architects work till they die, right? Very few retire. Some are now doing that. But I hope to just keep working till, I can't. But painting, I'm shifting more and more time to painting. I want to continue doing that because I enjoy it. So is that a retirement plan? No, not so much. It's more just shifting my time. And I have much more flexibility in my time today after we've had our company for over 30 years. I have a lot more flexibility with my time than I did when I was 28, when Ron and I started our company. And so there's more freedom in how I spend my time, and that's great. Yes, last question. unless someone just begs. Yes.
I see one of your interests is saltwater
Well, yes, it's true. I love saltwater fly fishing. Does that inspire my painting? Everything inspires my painting, from political violence to saltwater fly fishing and everything in between. Saltwater fly fishing, to me, again, it's movement, it's dance, it's this incredibly rhythmic, beautiful kind of way of learning to move your body to achieve a goal. There's very few places that you go fly fishing where it's boring and ugly. They tend to be full of water, so it's, for me, really kind of exhilarating and beautiful and spiritual. There's this challenge. If you're really into catching fish, fly fishing is the most ridiculous way to try to do that, because it's the hardest possible way to actually catch a fish, because you're using this totally artificial human-made thing to try to imitate, in our case, usually bait fish. And you're trying to imitate the movement of a bait fish in the water by the way you retrieve it. And then, we've gone saltwater fly fishing for big game, and, you're there with this little fly rod and these little reels, and you see the other boats around you chasing the same fish, and they have those rods that are about this long and this thick, and these reels, and every crank on the reel is like 5 cranks, and you're there with this little stupid, trying to chase the same fish. So you're completely outgunned. You're completely at the mercy of your ability to work with this fish in a way that you can't rely on the equipment. If you rely on the equipment, it blows up. You destroy it. And it's really expensive equipment. And so you have to rely on how you move and how you get the fish to move. And it's this kind of really unique dance that you engage in while you're on a boat in the water away from land. And look, let's face it, land is where all the pressure is. Land is where everything that sucks lives, right? On the water, you're in paradise. It's like you've left it all behind and you're in this magical world of make-believe. And so fly fishing for me is that. You're kind of leaving all of that behind you, and you're going out into this new land, so to speak, in a new adventure. And you get to dance differently and move differently. So I think we are out of time officially. Yeah, it's 11:08. So really, I want to just say thank you all for coming, and enjoy your weekend.